castle of the Queen. The Highlands air tasted of ozone and ancient decay. Sarah moved through the knee-high bracken with a predatory grace that felt both alien and intuitive. Her vampiric senses, heightened, jagged, and terrifyingly precise, picked up the rhythmic thrum of the mountain. It wasn't geological, it was the heartbeat of the castle ahead, a sprawling, gothic monstrosity carved directly into the dark granite of the cliffside. Behind her, the rhythmic crunch of boots on wet heather stopped. Christine, Stephanie, and Jeff huddled in the shadow of a jagged basalt outcrop. They were human, their breathing ragged, their hearts hammering against their ribs like trapped birds. Sarah felt those heartbeats as clearly as if they were her own, a frantic, syncopated percussion that made her stomach churn with a hunger she fought to suppress. "Stay low," Sarah whispered, her voice a serrated rasp. "The sentries aren't patrolling the perimeter. They're guarding the ley lines." She gestured toward the fortress. Along the outer curtain wall, figures moved with unnatural fluidity, vampire kin, their eyes glowing like embers in the mist. They were positioned at precise geometric intervals, their hands pressed against the cold stone, feeding the wards. Jeff squinted through his night vision scope, then lowered it, his face pale. "Sarah, there's too many. We counted 24 on the north wall alone. If we try to cross that courtyard, we're dead before we hit the gate." Sarah ignored him, her focus fixed on the inner sanctum of the castle. Even from this distance, she could feel the gravity of the Queen's power. It was a suffocating pressure, a psychic static that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. She crouched, moving to the edge of the ridge, and peered down. The scale of the gathering was soul-crushing. Below, the castle grounds were a sea of shifting shadows. Hundreds of vampires stood in silent, hypnotic rows, facing the central keep. In the center of the courtyard, David stood on a raised dais, his presence radiating a sickening, oily arrogance. He was flanked by figures draped in heavy, velvet robes, their faces obscured by iron masks. They were conducting a chant, a low, discordant hum that vibrated in Sarah's teeth. "Look," Stephanie whispered, her voice trembling as she pointed toward the dais. Sarah adjusted her sight. David wasn't just posturing. He was channeling, his hands wreathed in violet, necrotic flame. He was tearing the veil between worlds, weaving the energy of his gathered thralls into a singular, devastating spire of black light that shot upward, piercing the heavy cloud cover. "They're pinning the vortex," Sarah realized, the horror of it settling deep in her marrow. "They aren't just calling for an army. They're anchoring the Queen's influence into the very bedrock of the country." "We can't stop that," Christine muttered, clutching her sidearm with white-knuckled intensity. "Sarah, we need to regroup. We need more than, 4 of us? We're trying to stop a god with a handful of silver and a few prayers." Sarah turned, her eyes reflecting the pale moonlight. For a second, the predatory glow dimmed, revealing the terrified, grieving girl who had once crossed a lake on a dare. "We aren't here to win a war, Christine. We're here to save Rachel. If we lose the world, I don't care. But I am not leaving her in that slaughterhouse." As she spoke, a figure emerged from the depths of the keep, escorted by 2 hulking, armored guards. Even in the darkness, Sarah's heart, cold and stilled, seemed to stutter. It was Rachel. She was dressed in ceremonial leather, her skin unnaturally pale, her movements precise and devoid of the chaotic, spirited energy that had defined her. There was a metal collar clamped around her throat, pulsating with a faint, rhythmic red light, the mark of absolute obedience. She didn't look like a prisoner, she looked like a weapon being sharpened for its first kill. David approached her, bowing with theatrical, mocking grace. He gestured toward the vortex, and Rachel stepped forward, extending her hands into the black light. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry out. She simply became a conduit, her face a mask of serene, hollow obedience. "God," Jeff breathed, turning his head away. "They've hollowed her out. There's nothing left." "There is," Sarah insisted, though her voice wavered. She saw the way Rachel's fingers twitched, a micro-movement, a subconscious rebellion against the crushing weight of the Queen's mental leash. She's fighting it. She's just buried too deep. She's an instrument now, Sarah, Stephanie said softly, laying a hand on Sarah's shoulder. If you go down there, you're not just fighting David. You're fighting her. Can you do that? Can you kill her to save the world? Sarah watched Rachel's expressionless face, the way she stood rigid while the dark energy scorched the air around her. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The girl she grew up with was a hostage in her own body. The mission had changed. It wasn't a rescue anymore, it was a surgical strike. She didn't need to infiltrate, she needed to break the connection. I don't need to kill her, Sarah said, her voice turning cold, hardening into a resolve that felt like iron. I need to shatter the leash. And I need to get her out before the ritual reaches its peak. She stood up, ignoring the way her joints creaked. The surrounding forest seemed to lean in, the shadows stretching toward the fortress as if acknowledging the predator in their midst. Check your magazines, Sarah commanded, her tone brooking no argument. Silver, white phosphorus, whatever you have left. We're not going through the gate. We're going through the drainage conduits near the north cistern. It leads directly beneath the ritual chamber. That's a suicide run, Jeff warned. The sewers are probably filled with the dregs, the ones who couldn't stand in the courtyard. Then we'll kill the dregs, Sarah said, pulling a blade from her holster and checking its edge. She looked at her friends, the people who had followed her into this hell, risking their lives for a ghost of a chance. She felt a surge of loyalty so intense it burned. If we die tonight, we die as the people who tried. If we wait, we die as nothing more than cattle. She turned and began to descend the ridge, moving into the shadows of the castle's outer wall. The smell of sulfur and stale blood grew stronger, overwhelming the crisp mountain air. Every step took them closer to the heart of the Queen's domain, and with every step, the psychic pressure increased, pressing against Sarah's skull like a vice. She could hear them now, the whispers of the ancients, the frantic, tortured thoughts of the thralls, the rhythmic, booming cadence of the ritual. It was a cacophony of madness. Sarah pushed it back, compartmentalizing her fear, her humanity, and her rage. She reached the iron grating of the cistern, rusted and slick with algae. She gripped the bars, her vampiric strength bowing the cold metal until it groaned and snapped. She slid through, the darkness swallowing her whole, and turned to beckon her friends into the abyss. Don't look up, she whispered as Jeff and the others descended into the sludge. Don't listen to the voices. Focus on the steel. Focus on the kill. They moved forward, a tiny, desperate flicker of defiance in the suffocating dark of the Queen's kingdom. Above them, the sky was tearing open, but below, in the damp, claustrophobic tunnels, Sarah was already beginning to hunt. The damp air of the subterranean tunnels clung to Sarah's skin like a wet shroud, tasting of rusted iron and stagnant centuries. Above them, the castle breathed, a low, rhythmic vibration that shuddered through the stone floor beneath their boots. It wasn't the sound of machinery, it was the hum of a hive. Stay close, Sarah whispered, her voice barely a breath. She signaled for Christine and the others to hug the curvature of the slime-slicked wall. They reached a ventilation grate, wrought iron filigreed with twisting, vine-like patterns that looked uncomfortably like veins. Sarah leaned in, pressing her ear against the freezing metal. Below the grate, a massive vaulted chamber opened up. It was bathed in the sickly, flickering violet hue of necroflame, magic that didn't illuminate, but rather bruised the air around it. Sarah's breath hitched. In the center of the chamber stood a monolithic obsidian dais. Bound by silver chains that pulsed with faint, sickly light, Rachel was suspended in the air. She didn't look like the spirited girl who had once joked about urban legends on a sunny lake. She was hollowed out, her skin pale as parchment, eyes fixed on an unseen point in the ceiling. She wore a ceremonial gown that seemed to be stitched from shadows, and her movements were jerky, puppet-like, as if someone, or something, was yanking invisible strings. David stood at the base of the dais, his back to them. He was reciting something in a tongue that made Sarah's teeth ache, a guttural language that sounded like grinding tectonic plates. Beside him, the figure of Nick, or what used to be Nick, stood with his hands raised, fingers tracing intricate, leading sigils into the air. This was AJ. The entity looked bored, his movements precise and clinical, completely indifferent to the agony etched into Rachel's rigid frame. "Look at her," Christine whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah didn't look away. She couldn't. She watched as David pulled a jagged, obsidian dagger from his belt and held it toward Rachel's throat. He didn't cut, he merely hovered the tip of the blade an inch from her skin, and Sarah watched, horrified, as dark, oily smoke began to seep from Rachel's pores, coiling around the blade like a hungry serpent. She's a conduit, Sarah realized, the horror dawning on her with the weight of a physical blow. They aren't just initiating her. They're using her as an anchor to bridge the Queen's power into the physical realm. Jeff gripped his crossbow, his knuckles white. "We have to pull her down. Now. If we move now, we kill her," Sarah hissed, grabbing his arm. Her grip was tight, tighter than it should have been. She felt the internal snap of her own vampiric strength surging, a hungry, cold heat bubbling in her chest. She forced it down, burying the predatory instinct beneath a layer of ice-cold focus. "Look at the patterns on the floor. If we break the seal before they finish the sequence, the backlash will liquefy her organs. We have to disrupt the rhythm, not just the physical restraints." Below, Rachel's head snapped toward their position. For a heartbeat, the glassy, vacant look in her eyes shattered. The pupils dilated, shifting from that eerie, unnatural vampiric red back to a panicked, human hazel. She saw them. A flicker of recognition, a desperate, pleading scream that never left her throat, distorted her features. Then, the mask of the thrall slammed back down, her face turning into a stone-cold void. "She's still in there," Stephanie breathed, tears welling in her eyes. "Sarah, she's still there." "I know," Sarah said, her jaw tight. The sight of Rachel's brief, agonizing return to herself hit Sarah harder than any physical blow. The last sliver of naive hope she had carried, the dream that she could simply sneak in, grab her friend, and run, evaporated. The reality was a cold, sharp blade. Rachel wasn't just a prisoner, she was a weapon, and David was holding the trigger. Sarah looked at the group. She saw the fear in them, but she also saw their commitment. She realized then that they were no longer a rescue party. They were a suicide squad. "The ritual is peaking," Sarah observed, watching AJ's hands move with increasing speed. "The moment they complete the final sigil, the energy will anchor. If that happens, Rachel is gone. Not just lost to us, but consumed by the Queen. Her soul will be the battery for the expansion." "What do we do?" Christine asked, checking the magazine of her specialized sidearm. Sarah unsheathed her blade, a weapon she had scavenged from a fallen guard in London, inscribed with runes that hummed against her palm. "We don't go for them. We go for the source. That obsidian dais is the fulcrum. If we shatter the dais, the feedback loop will break the ritual's hold. It will cause a massive surge of dark energy, but it might, just might, be enough to snap Rachel out of it long enough for us to extract her." "Might?" Jeff echoed grimly. "It's the only path left," Sarah said, her voice dropping into a tone of absolute, terrifying calm. "We stop playing the stealth game. We become the catalyst." She reached out, touching the cold iron of the ventilation grate. With a singular, effortless motion of her enhanced strength, she pulled. The metal groaned and warped, the rivets popping like gunfire. As the grate gave way, she didn't wait. She vaulted into the chamber, her boots hitting the stone floor with a heavy thud that echoed like a war drum. Below, the chanting stopped instantly. David spun around, his face twisting into a mask of cruel delight. AJ didn't even turn, but the sigils in the air turned a violent, screaming crimson. "Sarah," David purred, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics. "I was wondering when you'd finally stop scurrying in the pipes and step into the light. Or should I say, the shadow." "Shut up," Sarah commanded, leveling her gaze at him. She felt the adrenaline, the hunger, and the searing, protective rage of a lifetime of friendship all coalescing into a single, lethal point. The air in the room grew heavy, the pressure dropping until their ears popped. The ritual chamber hummed with a sound like 1,000 angry hornets. Sarah stood in the center of the room, her allies dropping down behind her, forming a wall of defiance against the ancient, encroaching dark. Rachel hung above them, motionless, save for a single, dark tear tracking a path through the dust on her cheek. "Kill them," David said, his voice devoid of any pretense of warmth. "Keep the conduit intact. Tear the rest of them apart." From the shadows of the dais, the elite guards, pale, hulking things with elongated limbs, began to unfold, their eyes glowing like dying embers in the dark. Sarah didn't look at them. She looked at Rachel. "I'm coming for you," Sarah whispered. The first of the guards lunged, and the room erupted into a symphony of shattering stone and steel. The infiltration was over. The war had begun. The air in the chamber tasted of ozone and ancient, congealed blood. Sarah landed in a crouch, her boots crunching on the brittle, ash-covered stone of the dais floor. Beside her, Christine, Stephanie, and Jeff hit the ground like shadows, weapons raised, but the element of surprise had lasted exactly 3 seconds. A high-pitched, harmonic whine vibrated through the masonry, a security seal. The heavy iron doors at the far end of the chamber slammed shut with the finality of a guillotine. David stood on the dais, his hands raised, fingers dancing in the air as if playing a piano made of invisible threads. He didn't look frightened, he looked amused. "I told you, Sarah," he purred, his voice amplified by the chamber's unnatural acoustics. "You are an infestation. And when one finds an infestation, one reaches for the pesticide." At his side, the man wearing Nick's face, AJ, stepped forward. His eyes were not human. They were shifting pools of stagnant violet, swirling with the chaotic energy of the dark magic that had effectively erased Nick's soul. He didn't speak. He simply pointed a pale, trembling finger, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to detach themselves from the walls. "Jeff, watch your 6. Sarah screamed. She didn't wait for the order. She lunged, her vampiric speed allowing her to blur across the distance, her blade aiming for the silver filigreed bindings that shackled Rachel to the obsidian dais. Rachel screamed a raw, inhuman sound that vibrated in Sarah's teeth. The thrall didn't move as a combatant. She writhed like a cornered animal, her skin translucent, veins pulsing with a sickly, rhythmic black light. The ritual was feeding off her, draining her humanity to fuel the Queen's expansion. "Don't touch the seals, Sarah." David laughed, flicking his wrist. A kinetic blast slammed into Sarah, sending her sprawling across the flagstones. She rolled, coming to a stop near Stephanie, who was already engaged in a brutal dance with 3 elite guards, tall, desiccated things in funeral garb, their fangs elongated into serrated needles. Stephanie fired her modified stake launcher, the wooden bolts whistling through the air. One caught a guard in the throat, pinning him to a pillar, but the others didn't even flinch. "The magic!" Sarah shouted, scrambling to her feet, her own strength failing to mask the sting of the impact. "AJ is the anchor. If we break his focus, the seals collapse." Easier said than done. Christine fired over the top of a stone altar, her pistol spitting silver nitrate rounds that hissed as they burned through the guard's necrotic flesh. "We're being cut off. The entire room is shifting." The floor beneath them groaned. The room was not merely a chamber, it was a living extension of Queen Stacy's will. Massive, stone-hewn gargoyles lining the upper galleries began to stir, their heavy wings unfurling with the sound of grinding tectonic plates. Sarah looked at Rachel, then at AJ. The possessed boy was a conduit, his body glowing with an intensity that burned the very air around him. He began to chant, a low, guttural language that made Sarah's nose bleed. "Jeff, distract David," Sarah roared, abandoning all caution. "Christine, Stephanie, keep the guards off my back. I'm going for the anchor." Jeff didn't hesitate. He pulled a phosphorus flare from his vest, ignited it, and hurled it directly at David's feet. The magnesium bright light turned the chamber into a blinding white hell. David hissed, shielding his eyes, his concentration momentarily shattered. The spellbinding Sarah's limbs snapped. She surged forward, sprinting up the steps of the dais. AJ turned his gaze toward her. His mouth opened, and black vapor spilled out, a swarm of necrotic moths, buzzing with dark intent. They lashed out, tearing at Sarah's clothes, her skin, stinging her with paralyzing toxins. Sarah bit her lip until she tasted blood, using the pain to ground herself. She forced her body to keep moving, her boots sliding on the slick, ritual-stained obsidian. She reached AJ. He looked at her with Nick's eyes, and for a heartbeat, a terrifying, flickering second, the violet haze faded. "Sarah," a voice whispered. It was Nick, buried under miles of dark enchantment, terrified and pleading. Sarah's momentum faltered. "Nick." "Don't," the voice croaked, then snapped back into the hollow, mocking tone of the entity. AJ's hand shot out, catching Sarah by the throat and lifting her into the air. "Loyalty is a sickness," AJ hissed, his grip tightening. Sarah kicked out, her heel connecting with his chest, but he was like a statue, immovable. She reached for the small, consecrated dagger she'd kept hidden in her boot, the one thing she'd forged in the ruins of the first house. "I'm not here for you," she wheezed, her vision darkening. She drove the dagger not into AJ, but into the obsidian seal beneath his feet. The reaction was instantaneous. A shockwave of pure, holy light erupted from the contact point. It shattered the stone, sending splinters of black rock flying like shrapnel. AJ was thrown back, his connection to the ritual severed, his body convulsing as the chaotic energy he'd been holding back vented into the air. The ceiling began to groan. Dust and debris rained down as the room's magical integrity plummeted. "You fool!" David screamed, stumbling through the clearing haze, his face a mask of rage. "You've destabilized the entire wing." "Good." Sarah dropped to the floor, lungs burning, and turned to the dais. Rachel was finally silent, her head lolling back, the black light in her veins dimming. The chains that had held her began to turn to dust, the iron falling away in rusted flakes. "Rachel!" Sarah lunged for her, catching her friend as she slumped forward. Rachel felt ice-cold, her skin gray and brittle. "Rachel, look at me." Rachel's eyes fluttered open. They were bloodshot, the iris almost entirely engulfed by the dark, but there was a flicker of recognition there, a spark of the girl who had teased her about the urban legends at the lake. "Sarah," Rachel whispered, her voice like grinding glass. "It's so loud." "The Queen, she's everywhere." "We're leaving," Sarah said, hauling Rachel's dead weight onto her shoulder. "We're going home." "There is no home left, Sarah," Rachel coughed, dark fluid trickling from the corner of her mouth. A deafening crack echoed through the chamber. A massive section of the ceiling gave way, collapsing onto the far side of the room and crushing 3 of the elite guards beneath tons of masonry. The castle was dying, and it was taking everything within it down into the dark earth. "Jeff." "Christine." "Now." Sarah screamed, hauling Rachel toward the shattered exit portal, where the stairwell was already buckling into a jagged, impassable maw. David recovered, his eyes glowing with a malevolent, shimmering gold. He raised both hands, and the shadows in the room coalesced into a wall of solid darkness, blocking their path. "No one leaves," David spat, his voice no longer human, but a chorus of 1,000 screaming spirits. "The Queen's hunger does not end until the blood is drained." Stephanie sprinted past Sarah, throwing a satchel of high-grade, silver dust explosives at the base of the pillar holding up the central arch. "Sarah, go. We'll hold the line." "No." Sarah cried, clutching Rachel. Go! Stephanie roared, her face twisted in a mask of absolute defiance. She pulled the trigger on her detonator. The explosion wasn't a sound, it was a pressure wave that flattened the remaining guards and shattered the shadow wall blocking their path. Sarah grabbed Rachel, diving through the opening just as the world erupted behind her in a roar of fire and falling stone. She tumbled into the cold, damp dark of a drainage corridor, skidding through slick mud, the sound of the castle's collapse echoing like thunder. Behind her, the screams of the guards, and the silence of her friends, told her everything she needed to know. She didn't stop. She crawled through the muck, dragging Rachel behind her, lungs heaving, blood from her own wounds mixing with the grime. The tunnel tilted, light from the distant, gray Highlands sky visible at the far end of the pipe. She pushed forward, a vampire now, embracing the cold, hard reality of what she had become. The rescue was over.